Today, we actually have a very similar situation. We have every municipal government, every local county government in the United States of America is subordinate to what's called Dillon's rule that says that none of these local, municipal, and county governments have agency of their own. They have no sovereignty, and the people living within their jurisdiction aren't citizens of those local communities. They're just tenants living within the jurisdiction of a state subdivision. A municipality is seen as a subdivision of the state, just as the colonies were seen as subdivisions of the empire. And as such, they have no authority to make laws of their own without the permission of the state.
Mhm.
That puts us in a precarious position these days because the state legislatures are generally captured legislatures, captured by corporate lobbyists, and the laws that they write, when they're of interest and importance to profit making at the commercial level, that the laws generally have attached to them preemptive language that says, by the way, here's our regulations. That's the most protection anybody is going to be allowed to have. Local governments aren't allowed to protect themselves any more than the state has arranged in conjunction and consultation with the lobbyist for the industries. Now, that leaves us in a bad spot, and it also suggests that here's the second of these grievances in the Declaration that 250 years later remains unreconciled, still has not been solved. And it leads to the question, um, why do we really think that any of the regular folks, the working folks, would have joined in the revolution, so-called, if it turned out to be just a way for the commercial interests to separate themselves from the empire and then have their way with the colonies or the ex-colonies as they will?
Welcome to Truth and Reckoning, a broadcast from CELDF. In this show, we'll learn from frontline organizers and communities fighting against environmental destruction. We'll explore different perspectives and innovative strategies for movement building, the potency and the potential of rights of nature, and effective action in defense of our communities. And we'll share inspiring stories of people working towards right relationship with the land and each other. I am your host, Max Wilbert.
Welcome to Truth and Reckoning, CELDF's Substack podcast series. Joining me here today is Ben Price, CELDF's Education Director. My name is Kai Hushka. I'm the Executive Director for CELDF. We're wanting to dig in today to an aspect of the Declaration of Independence that we at least think a lot of people don't or haven't really spent time with. And the reason we're doing this is part of a series that we launched a few months back called America 250, a Revolutionary Perspective. And we've been walking through different themes, different entry points into the Declaration as to what it meant at the time and leading up to that period of history, and really what it's meant since then and what it really means today. And so we've done so, if you haven't been tracking, through articles and essays, recordings, video recordings of different kind of snippets of, again, the different contexts, the different layers of the Declaration itself. And we've also started to post interviews with different guests to talk about, again, those different themes. We recently did an interview with Dina Gilio Whitaker and Kiala Kelly, really digging into the systemic racist reality of the Declaration, and of course eventually encoded into the Constitution itself. So really talking about history from really people who were not recognized by those who were writing documents like the Declaration of Independence and writing documents eventually like the Constitution, or if they were thought about, they weren't thought about in the same context as white landowning males were. And today really is picking up on a different theme, which is about the demands and really the grievances that led to the ultimate demand, which was to separate from the British Empire. And um, in the Declaration of Independence, if you haven't picked it up lately and blown off the dust and reread it, that second half of the Declaration really is the list of grievances, 27 grievances that the people in the colonies there levied against the king. Though I don't know, Ben, I was reading it, rereading it this morning in preparation to sitting down with you, and the truth is, it wasn't really just the king, right? It was the whole
No,
aristocracy. It was the East India Company. You know, it's really the corporate state of the time, as CELDF has been using that term for many years to describe the relationship between corporate actors, the big corporate entities, and government itself. I mean, you had that identical situation back then, even though they wanted to point the finger at the king, much that people want to point the finger at, you know, who's ever sitting in the Oval Office, so to speak. But yeah, it struck me that, you know, there's a lot going on, and again, historically speaking, you know, many of the things that we get exposed to, let's say through the books that we end up reading or the school courses we go to, are really not just incomplete, but like we've been doing through this series, trying to tackle some big myths and some really just lies, you know, falsities about what was intended, where we've ended up, what the result has been. And, you know, that's really been um, the main thing driving us through this A250 series in the way that we have, but of course really represents CELDF as a whole and being the truth tellers we are. But I guess I want to maybe just kick off our conversation with, you know, what was sort of the historical context that fed into those grievances, maybe setting some up, you know, because it didn't just happen, right? It's someone
no,
just wake
no.
up and write a list of complaints. You know, it was going on for a long period of time, different actions, different things were happening, and then of course, in a lot of ways, things weren't happening that were not to the satisfaction of of the people in the various colonies at the time. So yeah, just kind of maybe take it from there, Ben.
Sure, and just the quickest of backgrounds, cover 100 years in about a minute and a half, which is to say 100 years before what is called the American Revolution, but really we should call it the War for Independence, the colonies' independence from the British. Certainly, the indigenous people weren't looking for independence from anyone but everybody that was
Hmm.
trying to dictate to them. But 100 years before the Americans sought separation from the empire, there was a civil war in Britain. Actually, a couple of them back to back. And there were commoners there. There were regular working people who were looking for a place in the governance of the country, an end to hierarchical rule by an aristocracy and a royal family, and all of those things. A lot of the jargon that comes out of what we think of the American Revolution actually had its origins back then, like rule at the consent of the governed and no taxation without representation, and that the idea that the legitimacy of government comes from the consent of the governed, all of those things. But what's really important about it is for quite a few years, while there was a civil war going on in Britain, they beheaded a king, Charles I. There was a time when the British really lost their focus on the American colonies. And during that time, communities, and I mean really local communities, not states, what we think of as states today, experimented with governing themselves locally and making local laws, really to make their lives a little bit easier. What can we do to keep the hogs from running down Main Street, or basic, really simple laws, and they thought they should have a right to do that. But when the British got their act back together again, they reinstated a king, Charles II, and they sent their agents back to impose the British will on the colonies. We can imagine people who had a short while of some relief from that top-down rule didn't really want to relinquish what little forms of self-rule they had managed during the interim. And so there was, quite frankly, before the Declaration of Independence, there were revolts going on, particularly we read about in Western Massachusetts, for instance, and other places in the colonies. The regulators in the Carolinas prior to the Revolution, or the War for Independence. So there was a lot going on already in 1773. So 3 years before the Declaration, we had um, American colonists taking British controlled judges from the courts in Western Massachusetts and riding them back to Boston, depositing there, and letting the folks in charge and the royal governor know they didn't want any part of it, because these judges were simply mostly taking private farms for lack of payment of taxes, and the people were fed up. So there
Mhm.
was already plenty of energy going on in the colonies prior to the Declaration of Independence being written.
Yeah. I mean, we've I think it's been in a couple of pieces already where we've talked about, that level of unrest, um, and not just in a, let's say in today's terms, people weren't just protesting, right, or holding signs, or saying or writing their letters to the editor. They were taking action. What we would frame today, I guess, is direct action, right? And the example you just gave to me is a direct action where it's like, well, you're not only listening, but the decisions that do come down are not really the ones of which are in our best interest. So therefore, it's time for you to go. But we also know that at least in the um, in the writing realm, that what we know as the Declaration of Independence we spoke to is really informed by dozens of others. We think 90 to 100. I think the best book, if I'm not mistaken, is American Scripture by Pauline Maier, where she documents going into that history of what fed into really what we know as the Declaration of Independence that Thomas Jefferson gets credit for. So yeah, there was so much building up. Again, the words we are using now is the revolutionary moment. I think you and I would agree we're in a revolutionary moment now in 2026, and very much the case then. What also struck me, though, and I think it may have been the first time that this actually entered my brain, was the as we will get into, the grievances, most of those are around the ability for people to self-determine. The questioning
Very
of
much.
self-government. We can't make our own decisions that we need to because you have found all these ways to block us or deny us or oppress us. We know universally that's what communities are seeking, whether it's an indigenous community, other communities of color. The work we've been doing for 30 years is all about that. But it just struck me that that's also not a new, at that time, wasn't even a new idea, right? If you really look at the construction of societies that have been healthy and have sustained themselves over long periods of time, not depleting their land base, as well as keeping the societal configuration healthy and I would say generally happy, from my understanding, is it because it came from more consensus style decision making. It came from deliberative processes. It didn't come from hierarchical structures. And so even the pronouncement that we as white European descendants and the history we've been taught, that this was a great revelation somehow. But in truth, really, it's again spinning us back to where the balance point should be, as we've also done in the work of Rights of Nature, which is really about right relationship, which of course other people over millennia have understood. That's where we need to be, governmentally. That pronouncement was again a validation towards that. So to me, that's important, that in the midst of all that empire building at the time, colonizing as we call it, which of course hasn't stopped, people mobilize not only to point that out, not only list out the grievances, but take action ultimately. So to combine all of that.
Absolutely. Taking action was really what it was about. The war for secession from the empire started not with armies being um, organized against each other, but with people in the colonies standing up and saying this is not tolerable. Matter of fact, they named some of the laws that were imposed on the colonies during this 1770s, 1760s, and 70s era as intolerable acts, as laws that they should not have to tolerate. Most people were familiar with what we call the Boston Tea Party, and that was a 1773 direct action, not against the British Crown, but against the British East India Company, which was the largest corporation ever to exist. At one point, it had a standing army in India, in the subcontinent, that was larger than Britain's own army, than its own military. And frankly, the commercial interest in England, the very ones who mounted the Civil War against the crown, were still ascendant. What they gained was a limited monarchy. And what we see reflected in the colonies at that point is this commercial power flexing its muscles against the colonist. Today we think of that, how unjust it seems that communities, whether it's local communities or states, subsidizing giant corporations that make billions of dollars in profits a year and actually taking the people's treasury, taking their tax money and subsidizing those large corporations to do things that the people aren't going to benefit from, only the investors in those private corporations. A similar issue underlies the complaints that the colonists put forward against the British East India Company. When we talk about, well, tea taxes were unfair. I guess it seems kind of absurd that there should be a war for independence over tea. I mean, was it really loved that much by the colonists?
Mhm.
Please, come on. That wasn't the essence of the problem. It was that the taxes were imposed on the colonist because the corporation had gone to Parliament and asked that their tax be lower, that they get tax relief, that they, in fact, go without having to pay taxes, as we see going on today with large corporations. So this was definitely not just a matter of not liking kings. It was also a matter of not liking to be under the thumb of any centralized power, whether it was commercial or inherited, as in the royal family.
Yeah. Yeah, it's also interesting too the way that you just frame the tax structure. You do think about these large corporations that come into community and they work out all these amazing, you know, tax abatement, um, tax deals where they're, deferring whatever the terminology they use, but it really it's just the offloading of the tax burden somewhere else, which is really going to be the individual. So it's just a different scheme of what was employed years ago in the sense of who held power and to what effect and what was their purpose and who was going to benefit from those actions. So, when we, meaning you and I, or CELDF speaks about the fact that colonization never ended, I mean, you see just so many they're almost not even parallels. They're almost like overlays, right? Where they're almost completely in alignment. They're just named differently, or there's of course different characters involved. But that the revolution, as we've also talked about through the A250 project, it it wasn't successful for many reasons, despite what was said in the declaration at the onset about breaking the bonds, and when government no longer represents you, it's your your obligation, your duty to overthrow it. And then the grievances themselves, of which is the topic of today's conversation, very strong language. And of course, as we begin to look at some of these things, besides maybe the style of writing, the grievances are frighteningly similar, the same, not just similar, they're the same kind of grievances that people had in the late 1700s, we're still dealing with today. And it's not as if they just reappeared, right? You and I know from the study of history and the community organizing work we've done, as it never stopped. It just took on a slightly different form, different actors involved, and different sort of mutations of that centralized power came to bear, especially eventually through the construct of the U.S. Constitution itself. Yeah, we're it's not as if we're repeating history. It's sort of a moment that never really ended, right? It just transformed into something else. It's we're still in that moment. We're still those same people, let's say, but we've, in some ways, we've forgotten what it means to revolt. We've forgotten what it means to organize a real resistance. And if we take to heart this idea that we have a duty and obligation, then we need to step up and step in to actually make it happen, which is then the action orientation that needs to take place from those grievances of today, but also looking back at what were the grievances, what were what was the thinking at the time that got people to at least in the face of power, say no more, despite knowing that the odds were royally, no pun intended, against them.
I think that we've got a real disconnect between what people know about that time in our history and how it bears on our present and the situation we find ourselves in today. And one way to find out what people really were concerned about back then, I mean, we can read the history, and I've read it, and others have read it, and it seems very clear that there were actually two opponents to the British Empire, two groups that wanted to be severed from them, but both of those groups had diametrically opposed visions for where things should go after independence. And that's not something that we talk about very much. But we can look at the grievances in the Declaration of Independence and get a sense of what people were really concerned about, why the people who actually picked up their muskets and went out and fought the war. And it wasn't all the people with white powdered wigs. It was a lot of farmers. It was a lot of day workers. It was a lot of people who didn't have any reason to go to war against England and the empire unless they thought they could get something out of it that would improve their lives. And the very first thing that they complained about, and they sent delegates, you mentioned earlier that delegates from over 90 different communities. And I don't mean Pennsylvania and Massachusetts and Virginia and the Carolinas. I mean towns, small towns where they had town meetings. They had a little building they went to, and they made governing decisions for their little local community. And those places sent delegates to the Continental Congress and told them, here's why we think we need to end this connection to the empire. The very first one they mentioned, at the very top of the list of 27 important grievances was the one that accused the king, as the embodiment of the empire, of not allowing communities to make their own local laws for important issues that were for the good of the community, unless they got permission from the king. Now, it's a funny thing that today we find ourselves in a similar situation where we find people just taking the most recent um, atrocity against communities is the imposition of giant data centers that consume more water than the community can offer for those big facilities, and more energy than the community can generate for its own needs. I mean, this is, and then they're told by their own states and by the federal government that they have no authority to say no. They have no authority to prohibit or ban data centers from being sited. We saw the same thing in 2005 when fracking became just a huge thing in those states that have that gas in the geological formations under their feet. We saw the same thing with factory farms when they were imposed on farming communities, destroying their way of life, destroying independent farming, and really destroying our food system and the quality of the food that we eat,
Hmm.
centrally controlled by large corporations. So the very first complaint is that communities aren't allowed to govern themselves, at least on local issues that affect the community directly. And it
Do
seems
you
that
have
after 250 years, that grievance has still not been addressed by the United States of America. Why did we have the revolution? That's
do
the
you have
question.
do you have that do you have the grievances in front of you? I'd be curious, like, what's the actual wording of that one? And then I would ask you, like, are there others in that list that you find particularly
Absolutely.
interesting that you want to just read so people can kind of hear what the actual construct of how the grievance came
So the
across?
very first grievance in the Declaration reads like this, and it says, "He," referring to the king as the embodiment of the empire, "he has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good." Now it's short and sweet. It's really just as simple as you can get, but it's saying not that the state of Pennsylvania or the state of Massachusetts can't make laws, because there was no state. There were no states at all. There were communities that had town meetings. There was no nation. And so it wasn't the United States telling the king, you won't let us make laws, because there was no United States. I mean, the United States was not formed until 13 years later. And some of the official America 250 celebrations that say we're celebrating the birth of the United States don't understand that the United States formation was actually a victory on the side of one of those opposing contenders against the British Empire. We had the commoners, the common working people, who wanted to have a different form of government, non hierarchical, framed out and critiqued by Tom Paine in his famous essay, Common Sense. And then there was the other side that said, no, we want to really create a new nation built on the premises laid out by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations. It was really about how can we become a commercial powerhouse, a global powerhouse. And we have a continent in front of us. That was the aspiration. I mean, the Constitution that was written 13 years later, it's the only national constitution I'm aware of that has provisions within its own language for territorial expansion of the nation.
Hmm.
Most constitutions wouldn't do that. That would certainly not be a friendly gesture to surrounding nations, to their neighbors. But North American continent was seen as an empty space, not counting any of the millions of indigenous people who were already here for a long
Yeah.
time.
Yep. What are some of the other? I know I can't recall exactly, but I think there was. Did we count? Did we say there were about 17 of the grievances were really assertions of the right of self-government, something to that effect?
That's about right, I would
Yeah.
say. There's, just on average, most of them have to do with self-determination at the community level.
Hmm.
So, for instance, the second of these grievances, it reads like this: He, the king, as the empire, has forbidden his governors, that's the colonial governors, to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained. And when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. I mean, what's going on here is, okay, so if you won't allow our town meetings to make laws, so we go to your representative here in the colonies, the governor, and ask that person, always a male at these times, so we ask him to make laws that we need. And still, that governor needs your okay, and you don't ever get around to giving that okay.
Mm.
Today, we actually have a very similar situation. We have every municipal government, every local county government in the United States of America is subordinate to what's called Dillon's rule that says that none of these local, municipal, and county governments have agency of their own. They have no sovereignty, and the people living within their jurisdiction aren't citizens of those local communities. They're just tenants living within the jurisdiction of a state subdivision. A municipality is seen as a subdivision of the state, just as the colonies were seen as subdivisions of the empire, and as such, they have no authority to make laws of their own without the permission of the state.
Hmm.
That puts us in a precarious position these days because the state legislatures are generally captured legislatures, captured by corporate lobbyists, and the laws that they write, when they're of interest and importance to profit making at the commercial level, that the laws generally have attached to them preemptive language that says, by the way, here's our regulations. That's the most protection anybody is going to be allowed to have. Local governments aren't allowed to protect themselves any more than the state has arranged in conjunction and consultation with the lobbyist for the industries. Now, that leaves us in a bad spot, and it also suggests that here's the second of these grievances in the Declaration that 250 years later remains unreconciled, still has not been solved. And it leads to the question, um, why do we really think that any of the regular folks, the working folks, would have joined in the revolution, so-called, if it turned out to be just a way for the commercial interests to separate themselves from the empire and then have their way with the colonies or the ex-colonies as they will.
Yeah. I was looking at some of the other uh, grievances. Of course, we're encouraging everyone listening here and watching to to read it on their own. But I was just pulling on some that are so eerily similar to today. So there's one, it's probably fourth or fifth in the list. But think about, the regulatory world and what people go through to um, not just thinking they're going to be heard, but by the mobilized actions through that process, thinking they're going to actually have real power. This one always reminds me of that environment where it reads, "He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures." It just reminds me of, scheduling the regulatory hearing at a time when no one can go,
Yeah.
or limiting the ability of the people to be able to be heard, or the other elements of, well, you can say what you want, but it doesn't matter because we're only going to look at a small sliver of the reality of this corporate project. And again, the wording may not be how we would express it today, but the reality of how that functions is identical to what the complaints were
A-
of the people at the time.
and the language might be a little different than how we would say it today, but I think back when I was growing up in Philadelphia, so-called birthplace of democracy in the United States, and I was taught that revere these documents and to revere the Federalist founding fathers of the Constitution. Never mentioned any of the real revolutionaries. Never mentioned Tom Paine, really, who, by the way, isn't memorialized by the federal government in Washington D.C. the way other founding fathers, so called, were. But yeah, this idea that they can just hold their deliberative meetings, and their hearings somewhere else that people would have to ride their horses to for a day and a half to get to sounds pretty drastic. And as we read through these grievances, and I again invite our our audience to take a look at it themselves, you'd probably read through it and say, yeah, I can see why they were really unhappy. They would have had I'd have a revolution about this if they were doing it to me. And yet that's exactly where we find ourselves.
Mhm.
That you can't get to a regulatory hearing to find out if you're getting the data center. Number one, because you're probably not going to hear about it until there's 1 week left to hear grievances against the idea. And they've been talking about it behind the scenes for 2.5 years. Um, okay, so now you have to give up a day's work, or you have to travel a distance to the state capital, or whatever it might be. And we think, well, that would never happen.
Yeah.
But I tell you what, I want to look at if unless you had another one in mind,
I
I want to just real quick.
I
Go
had
ahead.
two others,
Okay.
and we don't have to spend time unpacking them, but the two that I wanted to pull out, this one's more specifically linked to the current administration, where it reads here, he has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. I mean, I love that. I love the wording. But to me, that immediately is the whole Doge project, right? Where you just created a whole new office and
Right.
and eat out our substance is exactly what that process did, right? Which was to completely pull away the necessary funding that people who were doing good work were receiving from supposedly our government. And then the other was actually, it's just below that. He says, he has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. And I read that one when I read legislatures really to mean us, right? If we're supposed to have people representing us, well, they're de facto supposed to be us. And if you really query people and poll people for a very long time now, not just recently, people are not happy and not supportive of the way that militarization has worked, right? But that continues to be ignored, not only ignored, but flaunted in the sense of further military incursions globally, as well as the fuel for that, which is our tax money keeps being either increased or larger portions keep going towards the budget of militarization. Again, an identical complaint of the people at the time, because that's exactly what was happening to the colonies at that period, where the East India Company and the British were doing their work globally speaking, and they needed the fuel of dollars coming from wherever they could get it, and it was about squeezing the colonies for that very money, which is identical to what our empire is doing under the banner of the U.S. flag and the U.S. Constitution here. So again, to your point, like, if people were to read this and say, "Oh yeah, I would also revolt," to your point, well, it's exactly,
What do we wait for?
when we say you're in a revolutionary moment, we're not just using that, you know, slightly or offhandedly or mildly. It's the hard, cold truth of where we sit. And so eventually I'd like to get into, maybe towards wrapping our conversation up here today, is, what is that galvanizing possibility, in the way that, the grievances eventually lead to this very firm, clear statement of we're done, right? They didn't specifically lay out, what reality they wanted. I mean, we could say that, and we know this, that the Declaration definitely informed the construct of the Articles of Confederation, including things like the standing army grievance. That was something that the people were very deliberate about when they wrote that that document of collectivism. Was we didn't want that. We wanted the
Mhm.
capability of self-government. We didn't want centralized power. So they pulled on a lot of those good elements that, again, were not new in my mind. Obviously, it was just a reflection of other societies who understood how to be more deliberative and collective, and work on being really, I guess you could say, democratic, right? It was a move towards truer democracy. So yeah, it's quite stunning to see that we are where we're at, yet the mobilization in the way that period of history eventually led to, hasn't happened. So anyway, you said you had a couple other things that you wanted to pull on
That-
as well.
Well, but rather than go through them, yeah, I think they're worth looking at. And if we had more time, I'd want to. There is just to say let's see, the fifth of the grievances where the king says he's dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. Well, have we had our legislatures dissolved? I think some would argue that Congress is pretty much dissolved. It doesn't really do anything that isn't dictated to it at this point. But that's not the issue. Here it was actually town meetings, local governments, local gatherings of people making local laws were dissolved. And we might say, well, our local governments aren't dissolved, except for we have, 25 years of experience working with communities with CELDF, enacting local laws that have been overturned left and right because they interfered with the commercial interests that
Hmm.
wanted to use those communities for resource colonies or for sacrifice zones. So what happens there is that the legislatures locally, they're allowed to meet, but they're not allowed to have any effect. They're not allowed to actually make a difference. And there's one other aspect of that, and that's representation at the state level. No community has representation in their state legislature if their districts are gerrymandered by the two private parties, the private corporations. They're gerrymandered and not respecting community boundaries. So people can't actually have a forceful voice in their state legislature that speaks for that community, representing, as a republic would do, representing the interests of that community, as opposed to just some numerical equivalence of human beings living in carved up districts. That's just another thing. But there's so much. But back to your question, what would we do today, given that we're saying, more than half of these grievances from 1776 have not been resolved, essentially? They have to do with local government. What if that's the case? We're left with, again, the question of, was there ever a revolution? The answer being no. I think very clearly. There was a war for separation, but not a revolution. Was there an attempt at a revolution? Yes. They tried to do some different things in the Articles of Confederation, in which each of those new nations, they weren't states, they were nation states. They were Pennsylvania was a nation, Virginia was a nation, and they gathered in a alliance of friendship, as they called it, under the Articles of Confederation, um, where they maintained the internal community self-government that they argued they wanted for. Pennsylvania's Constitution, written in 1776, puts the community at the heart of the Constitution. And that doesn't mean the community of the whole. That means the communities that make up the new nation. Um, and other of the ex-colonies followed suit. And empowered their local people to be the ones who actually steer the government. In fact, even overseeing the laws that were passed and rejecting them if they didn't comport with the Constitution they had written, which was much more democratic. And we'll talk about that elsewhere.
Mhm.
But at any rate, what would we do now? I'm going to say one, if you don't mind, I would like to just jump the gun and say I'd like to make the first grievance in the Declaration of Independence my first grievance in a new list that would call for an absolute revolution in our form of governance. And that is the people being affected by governing decisions should be the ones who make them. And so we should be allowed to make laws that affect our local communities
Mhm.
and protect our local environments, our health and safety, and future generations from being abused. I mean, that seems to me to be a minimal requirement for a legitimate government, is the people being governed get to say what what the rules are going to be for
Yeah.
governing in their communities.
I mean, we have a different kind of opportunity here compared to those, let's say, in the 1700s. I think we're also dealing with circumstances that are monumentally more challenging than they did. And I'm speaking more specifically to climate destabilization and the climate catastrophe. So the very sources of life itself are being, to put it lightly, toyed with in a way that makes those future generations' assertions questionable, right? So that's a very different environment. Um, Governmentally structure-wise, as we've been speaking to, it's a very similar dynamic. It's a very similar orientation, I think. I think the additional thing that I'm thinking too, as we kind of get into this discussion about, you know, what are those grievances? Are they pretty much the same? And will we act upon them? And how do we mobilize to act upon them? So to me, I think it is actually fulfilling the good aspects, the good nature of the revolution itself. But I think combined with that, of course, is a need for transformation, specifically in two realms. One, into the non-human world, right? We can't just recreate a reality for ourselves, let's say governmentally and societally, in the context of what you just described, and our ability to make our own decisions, our own rules, our own choices. Well, that has to happen, yes, but not disconnected from the natural world, right? The whole rights of nature, right relationship part is absolutely critical. And that was pretty certain was not something that was on the minds of the drafters of the Declaration, let alone the Articles of Confederation, let alone, clearly not the U.S. Constitution. And I think the other realm really is, again, our orientation to other human beings, right? In the grievances themselves, the 27th grievance is about the savage Indians. So, of course, we have been working on, at least the white community, some of us been working on not only understanding the truth and trying to reckon with that, but developing means for right relationship with Native people, of course, enslaved people, the Black population really today, all of that, of course, has to transform in how we reimagine, let's say, the structure of government. But yeah, the revolt aspect, yeah, I'd be curious to see what is I guess to me, what is the galvanizing? Because I would think the grievances, we can get very specific to our times, right? Whether it's, student debt burden or healthcare
Mhm.
costs or the lack of economic opportunity or the realization that our environment has deteriorated so bad that, future generations are in jeopardy, not just future generations of humans, but other species as well. So we would have all these reasons, these grievances of what's transpired. But my guess is, boil them down, they're going to look pretty much the same as the ones that are in the Declaration from 1776. So knowing that that's the case, unless you have some other thoughts there, but knowing that that's the case, what is going to pull people together, even if it's in small moments? And maybe some of these moments have been happening that we just haven't really seen, but what is it going to take for people to truly revolt in the reality of which they've been immersed in, they've been born into, they've been indoctrinated into? Yet a number of us, of course, understand that and don't accept that, right? We reject it. Uh,
It's
and,
yeah,
what is it going to take to build the mobilization? Like you said, there were two groups. You had the gentry, the wealthy elite, who were clearly angling for control. I mean, that was their motivation more than anything, even if they had other elements of the sentiment of other aspects of the more pure, let's say, reasons to revolt. Eventually, what overcame them, because of, unfortunately, humans' propensity to greed, was the power to control. So, but then you had, those farmers, the landless, others who I think really came at it with the right mentality, the right heart energy, which is, we're done getting stepped on. We're done getting oppressed. We want a certain life. In order to get that, we've got to be able to make decisions. And so I think that's where most of us sit, right? We're not the
yeah.
1%.
And me I think we spend so much time wringing our hands thinking there's not a darn thing we can do about anything. We've got these multiple environmental crises with the climate and species die off. We've got cancer clusters all over the place wherever industry comes in. We've got, I mean, name the global issue that we have, and they just seem overwhelming. There's not a darn thing any individual or any one community could do to fix it. So let's stop pretending and let's just, enjoy the ride. No, we actually do have something we could do. I mean, just simple common sense, to borrow a phrase. Um, if every bad thing that happens to planet Earth happens from some particular place on the map, some specific community, in other words, where people live, if the people in that place where that bad thing happens, spewing junk, toxins into the air, into the water and the soil, whatever it is, if those people actually weren't prevented by force, by threat of violence, by threat of all kinds of sanctions, if they weren't forced to stand down and not try to stop those things and they were allowed to stop them, I can't I can't say that none of it would happen, but would suggest that a significant portion of what's destroying this planet would be put an end to, because the people living there would not want their children exposed to it. They wouldn't want to drink the water that we're drinking now. They would know that if they went fishing, they could eat the fish instead of throwing them back because they have too much mercury in them from the coal-powered plants. I
Mhm.
mean, if we actually had the very thing that the colonists complained about in their first grievance, and the reason it was their justification for going to war. If they could have actually got that from the government that they created afterwards, the US government, I don't think we'd be facing the same multiple crises that we're facing today. That I mean, no, that this is a model that of non-governments. This is a model of really failed governance that has been spread around the world and is reflected in neoliberal globalization and in all of the international corporate treaties that have been signed that actually take away democracy at the local, at the community level in all of the signature countries. I mean, we could have changed the world, but we didn't, and maybe
Yeah.
it's time we start again.
That the studies, the anthropological or sociological, I don't know what, maybe if they fall under both kind of realms, at least when the Western mind has gone in to try to understand other cultures, one of the things they discover is those systems of which have often been labeled as uncivilized, right, unsophisticated, have very sophisticated systems of cultural fabric that gets woven. One of the biggest one being is controlling humans' propensity to quest for power, right? The lust for power, the lust for greed, the inflation of the ego, again, to use more of a Western term. They understood that they needed to construct their systems of society and government to keep that in check.
Right.
Otherwise, you get exactly where we're at now. And so I see the push for really decentralization, for the honoring and the anchoring and the rooting of self-government is a major means for that, right? Because
Mhm.
you have this check on power in a way that you just don't have today in the centralized manner. And of course, not just centralized on paper and through court decisions, but of course backed up by force, whether it's the military or police or other forms of armed, ready for violence, and in a lot of cases engaging in violence against the people. As of course the more recent examples, at least media wise, is the death of the two people there in Minneapolis. But of course, it happens on a daily basis,
Mhm.
especially if you're a person of color with police forces. So it is ongoing. So yeah, you have this power dynamic that is why we're in the situation we're in. And I agree with you. I think that really should be the driving agent for people to just step up, mobilize, and throw off that kind of tyrannical power. Or as we've, tried to go into our trainings and work with communities, looking at evidence as often as we can, what's the evidence say? What's the historical critique say? So it's, again, not just you and I saying it, but
Right.
many others who've come at it from other ways. We use that study that came out of the collaboration of the two professors from Northwestern and Princeton that we refer to as the Princeton study. And, to boil it down based on the research they did is, they were very clear that the US is not a democracy. They call it a functioning oligarchy. When I would question maybe the word functioning for whom? Um, uh, so like, yeah, how much more do we need to know? How many more grievances do we need to draft before we understand that it's us? We have to be the ones that course correct, or we have to be the ones that, if you want to use a track metaphor, the baton's been handed to us.
Mhm.
Are we just going to sit down on the track, or are we going to try to carry that baton across the finish line, of course, in the ways we described earlier, where there's more that we're now obligated to understand and to consider, whether it's our relationship with other peoples that were not just marginalized, but were subjected to collective murders. People like to use the word genocide. As well as the natural world, the non-human world, that, that's a different thing than perhaps the colonists of the time were aware of or thinking about or part of. And so, and I know we're going to, as sort of our last, or getting to our last installment of the A250 series, we're really going to dig into revolution itself. So we're not
Mhm.
going to just leave it hanging here without maybe some more concrete ideas and answers, but we're going to dive into it. But yeah, it is something that, and I'm sure you do as well, that I think about on a daily basis. And of course, we've been trying to be catalysts, instigators to mobilize some of that. And, we've had some successes, but not enough really to really threaten the power structure as it sits, which is very much a corporate state, just like it was in 1776. It was a corporate state, and that corporate state structure has not gone away. And in fact, one can say it got improved through the so-called American experience or American experiment. So in some ways, it got made better. Uh, because of the revolution, or the Revolutionary War, I should say.
Well, the commercial interests after the British Civil War and after the American Independence War have ascendancy around the world. It's a form of government, and it frankly is a form of government that I guess we don't read about in history books because it's kind of a newer thing, 250 years old, if we want to say that. Um, but it is the commercial interests that are running things. And we could say maybe that's always been the case in some measure, but there hasn't been this focus on commerce, on wealth, on, fiat money running the world. And now that's what we have, and we're steeped in it. We're living in it. And as has been said by one of our mentors, fish discover water last. We don't recognize the problem that's all around us because we were born into it. We don't see that there's something unnatural about the situation when there's not a thing that's natural about it. That
Mhm.
our connection and our with each other, our way of relating to the natural world is skewed by a false belief that human beings are superior to nature and separate from it too, as though a biological creature that evolved on this planet could somehow suddenly wake up and be separate from the rest. And by derivation, superior to it, and therefore justification for the use of the whole planet and everything here as toys for our amusement, as things for our convenience. That's not the respectful kind of relationship that indigenous people express. And, folks will say, well, we don't want to go back and live in the jungle. We don't want to go back and live in tents. Um, that's not what it's about. It's about the way of relating to the world. It's about the way that we see each other, not
Mhm.
just the natural world, but also the natural world. And seeing each other as commodities or as resources is really what capitalism has done to us. It has
Mhm.
said the labor that we can extract from people is just as valuable as the oil we can extract from castor beans. We can sell it. It's just something we can buy and sell. That is not a natural or right relationship between other human beings. And we have corrections to be made. But, I think we want to also talk about, and we'll be talking about revolution in our next um, conversations in the A250 series. But we don't have to wait for there to be some kind of a war to have a revolution. The revolution doesn't require a war, it requires a transformation. And if we can transform the communities where we live to really look at the system that exists as obsolete and one that we no longer find legitimacy in, then we can begin to make the communities we prefer and want to live in that's respectful to the members of the community, regardless of the color, their heritage, their gender identification, whatever that background is that we constantly find ways to fight about. Finding right relationship doesn't highlight those differences. It highlights the similarities and it highlights the co codependence.
Yeah. I was
Not
about to
the
say, we talk about it in the sense of being biocentric, right? That you just described, that
Yeah,
natural systems are far more collaborative than they are competitive, because that's how healthy systems function. And of course, the way our government, our systems have been set up, they're highly competitive. They don't encourage collaboration. Um, yeah, and it's about individual pursuits versus mutual benefit. Again, also, it's all anti biology. Yet,
it's definitely that.
we are biological, right? So it's just it's quite stunning that a species that at least self proclaims to have the biggest brains of any species on the planet, can't not just understand that, but engage in that way and maintain it. Like, of course, we've spoken about a number of times here that there have been societies and groups who have understood that and have worked, that's work, right? It's
Hmm.
work to keep that intact. But unfortunately, those elements of human nature have gotten the best of us. And now that reality is also, in the way has got the best of the entire planet. But yeah, like the part of CELDF's work has been about, being truth tellers. I've been very excited about the A250 series and the different ways that we've gone at it. So for people who haven't engaged in the content, we very much encourage you to engage in it from the standpoint of unlearning, right, to learn. And so, from the Declaration itself, talking about the ideals versus realities, getting into the systemic racism and systemic sexism through the interviews that we had with with Dina and Kiala. We also have one that will be posted soon with Anthony Rogers, Wright Rogers, about the reality of the Black experience in the U.S. as related to the Declaration of Independence. We have this one talking about the demands and grievances, and then the one coming up about the revolution. So going to CELDF.org, going to the Truth and Reckoning Substack page, going to CELDF's YouTube page, you'll find the collections of all these A250 content, as well as other things that CELDF's engaged in. And we often don't do these in the interviews themselves, but just to remind people, this is who we are, right? I don't think you and I could imagine being engaged in anything else, but in order for us to be able to generate the content, to ultimately to work with those frontline communities, because that's our reason to exist. The content, the educating, the training is necessary, but all it has to be funneled into that action piece we've brought up a number of times. That only happens if people support us. So the financial donations, either to CELDF directly or to the Truth and Reckoning Substack page, it's why we can do these things. So we appreciate the people who have donated and encourage those who have been following, who are even new to us, to consider making a donation, because that's part of our reality to continue to do what we do.
Yeah, I really do encourage people to have a look at our Truth and Reckoning Substack page. Lots of articles, interviews, podcasts there in the series and out of the series. And I think you'll find plenty of reasons for stepping up and supporting the work that we're doing. So,
Yep. Well, Ben, always good talking. I know we talk on a daily basis, but nice to have kind of structured time to dig into the topic of today. So
there's never enough time. So I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks.
Hopefully soon we can do it in person. So instead of on screen.
That'd be great. Okay.
All right. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
I want to thank you for listening to our show and let you know a few ways you can support Truth and Reckoning. First, share this broadcast with your friends and family. Leave a positive review via your podcast app. Visit the Truth and Reckoning YouTube channel and leave a thumbs up and a comment. The full scope of the work of CELDF, including this show, comes with a financial cost. So if you're able to make a donation, go to CELDF.org. That's CELDF.org. But most importantly, our goal for this show is to empower you to take action. So the best way you can show your support is to get involved with your community and protecting the place where you live. Thank you very much.